The first thing my neighbor did when I moved in was take a picture of my cabin. Then he posted it in our neighborhood group with the caption, "New eyesore on the hill. Anyone know when the circus is coming to collect it?" By the next morning, the post had more than 100 laughing reactions. Someone called it a shed. Someone else said it looked like a homeless man's retirement plan. And the woman who lived across the road told me, to my face, that I was lowering everyone's property value. I just smiled. Because none of them knew why I had bought that tiny cabin. They didn't know why I had refused to tear it down. They didn't know why, every night after dark, I walked around the property with a flashlight. And they definitely didn't know what I had found beneath the floor. At the time, I had no idea that my little cabin would eventually bring police cars, lawyers, television cameras, and half the neighborhood onto my property. But when the ground underneath my home was finally opened, the same neighbors who had spent months laughing at me were suddenly begging to know how much the land was worth. My name is Thomas. And this is how the smallest house in the neighborhood turned out to be sitting on the biggest secret. I was 41 when I bought the cabin. I had recently gone through a divorce, lost most of my savings in the process, and realized that I couldn't afford the kind of house I had once imagined myself living in. For nearly 20 years, I had worked as a structural engineer. I spent my life designing things other people could afford. Homes. Office buildings. Renovations. I knew exactly how expensive property had become. And after my divorce, I was facing the possibility of moving into a small apartment and starting over from nothing. Then I found the cabin. It was 30 minutes outside the city, on a piece of land that had been listed for nearly 3 years. The cabin itself was tiny. 1 bedroom. 1 small kitchen. A living room that barely fit a couch and a table. The roof leaked. The windows were old. The porch was falling apart. And the foundation looked like it had been repaired more than once. But the land was beautiful. Almost 4 acres. A narrow forest behind the cabin. A hill that overlooked the valley. And a private road leading up to the property. The asking price was almost suspiciously low. So I hired a lawyer and started investigating. There were no major liens. No disputes. No environmental problems. The previous owner had died, and the property had been sold by a distant relative. As far as anyone could tell, there was nothing wrong with it. Still, something felt strange. The cabin was tiny compared to the size of the property. And it was unusually old. The county record said it had been built in 1947. I visited it 3 times before making an offer. Each time, I noticed the same thing. The house didn't feel like it had been built for the land. It felt like it had been built to protect something. I know how strange that sounds. But when you work in construction long enough, you learn to notice things. The foundation walls were thicker than necessary. Some of the floorboards were newer than the others. And the cabin was positioned in an odd place, almost exactly in the center of the property. Not near the best view. Not near the road. Directly over the flattest part of the land. I mentioned it to the realtor. She laughed. The original owner was probably just strange. Maybe. But I bought the cabin anyway. The first week after I moved in, I introduced myself to the neighbors. Most of them lived in large, modern homes. They were part of a private community that had been developed during the last 15 years. My cabin was the oldest building on the entire road. And it looked completely out of place. At first, people were polite. Then the jokes started. My closest neighbor was a man named Craig. He was one of those people who spoke loudly enough to make sure everyone nearby could hear him. The day he saw me repairing my porch, he walked over and looked at the cabin. "You planning on fixing this place up?" "That's the idea." Craig looked at the roof. Then the windows. Then the uneven walls. You know, demolition might actually be cheaper. I laughed. He didn't. A week later, I found out he had taken a picture of the cabin and posted it online. New eyesore on the hill. Anyone know when the circus is coming to collect it? People laughed. And I tried to ignore it. But then it became a regular thing. Someone complained about the appearance of my property. Someone reported that my old truck had been parked outside too long. The Homeowners Association, which technically did not have authority over my property, sent me a letter asking me to consider the aesthetic impact of my renovations. The woman across the road, Linda, told me directly that I was lowering property values. You could have afforded a normal house if you hadn't wasted your money on this dump. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't wasted my money. But I didn't. Instead, I kept working. I repaired the roof. I painted the exterior. I replaced the broken porch steps. And slowly, the cabin started looking better. But the strange feeling never went away. There was something beneath it. I couldn't explain it. At first, I thought it was the foundation. Then I thought it might be an old septic system. But when I walked across the living room floor, one section sounded different. Hollow. Not weak. Not damaged. Just hollow. I tapped the floorboards. The sound was obvious. There was a space underneath. I assumed it was a crawl space. But when I checked the outside of the cabin, I couldn't find any access point. That was unusual. Every part of a house has an explanation. Every space exists for a reason. And I couldn't find one. So one Saturday morning, I pulled back the rug and examined the floor. The boards looked old. But not as old as the rest of the house. Someone had replaced them. Carefully. I measured the area. It was almost perfectly square. 6 feet by 6 feet. I called a contractor I knew. His name was Mark. I didn't tell him what I suspected. I just asked him to look at the floor. He arrived that afternoon. He walked around. Tapped the boards. Then looked at me. What's underneath? That's what I'm trying to figure out. He found a gap near the edge of the floor. Then he slid a small inspection camera through it. For nearly 30 seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Mark slowly lowered the camera. I watched the screen. At first, all we could see was darkness. Then the flashlight revealed something. Concrete. A large concrete wall. Then another. And then, a staircase. Going down. I stared at Mark. Mark stared at me. That's not a crawl space, he said. No. It wasn't. The staircase led underground. The entrance had been sealed beneath the floor. And someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure nobody knew it existed. We spent the next 2 hours trying to understand what we were looking at. The camera revealed a small concrete corridor. At the end of it was a heavy metal door. There were wires running along the walls. Old pipes. And what looked like electrical equipment. Mark finally looked at me and said, "You need to call someone." I asked, "Who?" He didn't answer. Because we both knew. The police. I called the non-emergency number. Within an hour, 2 officers arrived. At first, they seemed amused. Another strange call from someone who had found an old basement. Then Mark showed them the footage. Their expressions changed. The officers contacted the county. The county contacted the Historical Records Office. And suddenly, I wasn't allowed to enter my own house. They brought in specialists. They brought in engineers. They brought in people from an agency I wasn't allowed to identify. And by sunset, there were 3 government vehicles parked outside my cabin. That's when my neighbors finally stopped laughing. Craig stood near the road, staring at the vehicles. "What the hell did you find?" I looked at him. "No idea." That was the truth. But by the next morning, the entire neighborhood was talking. Someone had posted photos of the government vehicles. People started speculating. A bunker. A drug tunnel. A hidden basement. Someone suggested a buried treasure room. Linda came to my door. For months, she had barely spoken to me unless she had a complaint. Now she was smiling. "Thomas, I was just wondering if you know how long all this will take." "I don't. I hope it doesn't affect the neighborhood." I almost laughed. 2 days later, I finally got an answer. The underground structure was a Cold War-era emergency communications facility. It had been built beneath the cabin sometime in the early 1950s. The cabin itself had been constructed to conceal it. Apparently, the original owner had worked for a government contractor. The underground facility was used as part of a regional communication network. Then, sometime in the 1970s, it was decommissioned. The equipment was removed. The entrance was sealed. And over time, the records were lost. The property had changed hands. The cabin had become just another old building. Nobody knew what was underneath. Except, the structure was much larger than anyone expected. The staircase led to one room. That room led to another corridor. The corridor led to several more underground chambers. There were old generators, communication equipment, storage rooms, and an emergency exit that opened deep inside the forest behind my cabin. The county records only showed the property boundaries. There was no mention of the facility, which meant nobody had valued the land properly. Nobody had inspected it. And when I bought the property, I had purchased everything above and below the ground. The discovery immediately became a legal problem. Government agencies wanted to investigate. Historical organizations wanted access. The county wanted to know whether the structure could be preserved. And suddenly, the tiny cabin everyone had mocked was sitting on a property nobody could agree about. Then things became even stranger. While searching old county records, an archivist found documents related to the original owner. His name was Walter Hayes. According to the records, Hayes had purchased the land in 1946, 1 year before the cabin was built. But his job description didn't match the construction. He was listed publicly as an electrician. Privately, however, he had worked for a contractor involved in communications infrastructure. And that contractor had received government funding. The archivist found something else. A newspaper article from 1952. It mentioned a construction accident involving a worker named Samuel Hayes, Walter's brother. The article said Samuel had died on the property. But there were no details. No police report. No official investigation. Just one sentence. Authorities declined to provide further information. That was when I realized there was more to the story. The underground facility had been hidden. But something else had been hidden too. I contacted the county historian. She came to the property a week later. Her name was Dr. Helen Morris. She was the first person who seemed more interested in the history than the value. We sat in my tiny kitchen while she studied the old documents. Then she said something that made me uncomfortable. "Have you ever noticed that your cabin is larger inside than the county plans suggest?" I laughed. "What?" She unfolded an old map. The original cabin had been listed as a much smaller structure. The building had been expanded. But not upward. The foundation had been expanded. Which meant parts of the underground structure could extend beyond the rooms that had already been discovered. We brought in ground-penetrating radar. The results showed another large underground section. beneath the northern side of the property. Not directly below the cabin. The equipment identified a rectangular structure. And inside that structure, several large metal objects. Now the entire neighborhood knew something significant had been found. The same people who had mocked my cabin were suddenly interested in being friendly. Craig started stopping by every afternoon. Linda began asking whether I needed help with anything. Even the homeowners association sent me a letter. Not about the appearance of my property. This time, they were concerned about preserving the historic character of the area. I couldn't believe it. The cabin they had called an eyesore had suddenly become historic. But I was starting to become suspicious. Because Craig knew more about the property than he should have. One afternoon, he asked me if they had found the second chamber. I looked at him. What second chamber? His face changed immediately. I just meant, if there was one. How did you know there might be another? Craig smiled. You said there were tunnels. No. I didn't. For the first time, Craig looked nervous. Then he left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I started thinking about everything that had happened. The mocking. The constant complaints. The pressure to demolish the cabin. Craig's obsession with the property. And suddenly, I wondered if there was a reason he had wanted the cabin gone. The next morning, I searched public property records. Craig had purchased his house 12 years earlier. But before that, he had worked for a company that specialized in commercial excavation. His father had worked for the county records department. I contacted my attorney. We began looking deeper. And then we found something. 30 years earlier, Craig's father had filed a request for access to the original property records. The request had been denied. 10 years later, another request had been made. Again, denied. Then, 2 years before I bought the cabin, Craig himself had made an offer to purchase the property. It had been rejected by the previous owner. He had known. Maybe not everything. But enough. Craig had spent years trying to get access to that land. And when I bought it, he had decided to pressure me into selling. Or demolishing the cabin. If I had torn it down without investigating the foundation, the underground structure could have been damaged. Or buried forever. I called Craig. He denied everything. He told me I was paranoid. Then he hung up. 2 days later, I received an offer. An anonymous buyer wanted to purchase my property. The amount was 3 times what I had paid. I refused. The offer increased. I refused again. Then came a 4th offer. 5 times what I had paid. At that point, I knew the land was worth far more than anyone was admitting. The underground structure was now being investigated by several agencies. But the second chamber had not yet been opened. The county wanted to wait for specialists. That gave Craig time. And he used it. One morning, I woke up to the sound of drilling. Someone was digging near the northern boundary of my property. I ran outside. A crew had arrived with equipment. Craig was standing beside them. What are you doing? He pointed toward the property line. Installing a drainage system. On my land? He smiled. Your survey might be wrong. I called the police. The officers arrived quickly. The crew was forced to stop. But before they left, one of the workers quietly handed me something. A small, rusted metal box. He had found it while digging. It had been buried less than 2 feet underground. Inside were old papers. Most were damaged. But one document was still readable. It was dated 1963. And it mentioned a transfer of archived materials. There was also a handwritten note. It said, "Nothing leaves this property until Hayes returns." I stared at it for nearly an hour. Who was Hayes? Walter had died decades earlier. His brother Samuel had supposedly died in the 1950s. And suddenly, I remembered the newspaper article. The accident. The lack of details. I showed the note to Dr. Morris. Her reaction was immediate. That can't be right. Why? Because Samuel Hayes didn't die on the property. I felt cold. She showed me another document. A death certificate. Samuel Hayes had been declared dead. But his body had never been recovered. There had been no autopsy. No burial. Nothing. The accident had been classified. For nearly 70 years, everyone had assumed he was dead. But there was no proof. The second chamber was finally opened 2 weeks later. It was much larger than anyone expected. The entrance was reinforced steel. Behind it was a storage facility. Inside were shelves, crates, old equipment, and one sealed room. The room had no windows. No markings. Just a door. When the specialists opened it, everyone stepped back. The room contained boxes of documents. Thousands of pages. Most were government records. Technical diagrams. Communications plans. Equipment logs. But hidden among them was a personal file. It belonged to Samuel Hayes. Inside was a letter. The letter had never been sent. It was addressed to Walter. And it explained everything. Samuel had discovered that equipment from the underground facility was being secretly sold through a private contractor. He had tried to report it. Instead, the accident had been staged. Samuel had escaped. But the people involved believed he had died. He went into hiding. Before disappearing, he returned to the facility and left evidence. He planned to come back. He never did. And that was why the note had said nothing leaves the property until Hayes returns. The underground chamber wasn't a treasure room. It was evidence. Evidence that had been buried for decades. And Craig? His father had known about it. That's why he had requested the property records. That's why Craig had tried to buy the land. But what they didn't know was whether the evidence still existed. Until I moved in. The investigation reopened old cases. There were no longer criminal charges possible against most of the people involved. Too much time had passed. Many were dead. But the historical significance of the discovery was enormous. And the documents had financial value too. Not just as government records, but as part of a historic property. Eventually, the county declared the underground facility a protected historical site. The government offered to purchase access rights. A historical foundation offered to fund preservation. And I was offered more money for my tiny cabin than most of my neighbors had paid for their enormous houses. The final irony came 6 months later. Craig's house was the one that went up for sale. He had spent years trying to control what happened to my property. Now he couldn't even afford to stay in his own. As for Linda, she stopped speaking to me. I think she was embarrassed. The homeowners association never contacted me again. And my little cabin? I kept it. I repaired it. I restored the original wood. I kept the small rooms. I kept the old porch. I even kept the crooked sign beside the driveway. Because I never wanted to forget what people had said. The shed. The eyesore. The circus. For months, everyone had judged me by what they could see. A tiny cabin. An old truck. A man starting over after divorce. They thought I had failed. They thought I had settled for less. But beneath the place they mocked was something they had spent years trying to find. And that taught me something I will never forget. People love to laugh at what they don't understand. They judge what they can see from the road. The size of your house. The car you drive. The clothes you wear. They assume they know the entire story. But sometimes, the most valuable things are hidden beneath the surface. And sometimes, the people laughing the loudest are laughing because they hope you never discover what they already know. The day the restoration work was finally completed, I stood on my porch and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. The cabin was still tiny. The roof was still old. The road was still quiet. And from the outside, nothing had really changed. But I knew what was underneath. And now, so did everyone else. The neighbors had laughed at my tiny cabin. Until they saw what was buried beneath it. And by then, the laughing had stopped. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Calm Verdict Stories, where every secret has a price, every lie leaves a trail, and every truth eventually leads to a verdict. This story is a dramatized fictional narrative created for storytelling and entertainment purposes.